There are millions of people who use Windows every single day, and almost all of them feel the same thing. They just can't quite explain it. Windows just feels worse, slower, noisier, like something has been lost. Most people blame the ads, or OneDrive, or the Copilot being pushed on our faces. I don't think any of those are actually the problem. I think they are evidence of something much bigger. There was a time when the best thing you could say about Windows is that you could barely notice it. You'd press the power button, wait a minute, open Chrome, maybe launch Steam, and when you're done, you could shut the computer off. Windows wasn't exciting, it wasn't beautiful, but it quietly got out of your way. That's exactly what an operating system is supposed to do. But today, Windows feels completely different. Before you've even opened an application, Windows is asking you to sign into your Microsoft account. It wants you to back up files to OneDrive. It recommends Microsoft Edge. It wants you to try Microsoft 365 Copilot. It shows weather, news, and celebrity gossip directly inside your start menu. Even something as simple as searching your own computer increasingly feels like searching Microsoft services instead. Everywhere you look, Windows is trying to sell you something, and none of these things are individually catastrophic. A OneDrive pop-up isn't the end of the world. Neither is another prompt asking you to use Microsoft Edge, or Copilot appearing inside Paint, or AI inside Notepad. But software rarely becomes frustrating because of one decision. It becomes frustrating because of hundreds of tiny decisions. Each one adds a little more friction, a little more noise, until eventually the operating system disappears, and all you notice is the company behind it. That's what I mean by the Slopification of Windows. Microsoft slowly transformed one of the world's greatest operating systems into something that increasingly serves Microsoft instead of serving you, the user. And the strange part is, none of this happened by accident. It happened because Windows stopped being Microsoft's product, and none of the things that people complain about are actually the real problem. They're just symptoms of a much bigger shift inside Microsoft. The easiest way to understand what happened to Windows isn't by looking at one big change. It's by looking at the small ones, because individually they're almost defensible. Microsoft is encouraging you to use OneDrive because cloud backups are useful. Fair enough. Microsoft wants you to use Edge because they built it. That makes business sense. They renamed Microsoft 365 to Microsoft 365 Copilot because AI is the future. Sure. But then they started putting Copilot inside Paint, inside Photos, inside Notepad, inside practically every application they could find. Features that nobody has asked for are suddenly unavoidable. Windows updates became larger, the operating system increasingly required a Microsoft account, even setting up a new PC became impossible without an internet connection unless you knew some obscure workarounds. Slowly, Windows stopped feeling like software you owned and started feeling like a service you rented. Even privacy became more complicated. Windows now collects more telemetry than older versions ever did. Most of those settings can be disabled, but only if you know where to look. For the average user, the defaults do the work. Microsoft's defaults. Then there are the updates. Enterprise customers, Microsoft's biggest clients, are given control over which updates they can deploy. They can delay them, test them, or roll them out gradually. Normal users, though, don't have that luxury. Millions of ordinary people effectively becomes Microsoft's largest beta testing group. Updates arrive, sometimes they can break printers, drivers, introduce new bugs, and only afterwards are they fixed. Again, none of these decisions are individually outrageous, but put them together and Windows begins to feel less of an operating system and more like an advertising platform that occasionally lets you open Excel. So the obvious question is why? Why would Microsoft deliberately make Windows feel worse? Most people would assume Microsoft just made bad design decisions. I don't think that's what happened at all. I think Windows was sacrificed for something much more valuable. In 2019, Microsoft made one of the most important investments in the company's history, $1 billion into a relatively unknown company called OpenAI. At that time, it looked like a bold bet, but today it looks obvious. When ChatGPT exploded in 2022, Microsoft suddenly found itself in one of the most valuable positions in the technology industry. For the first time in years, it looked like Microsoft had a chance of leading in the next era of computing. The CEO Satya Nadella understood something that many companies didn't. If artificial intelligence became the next major computing platform, Microsoft couldn't afford to miss it. The problem was, despite the investment, Microsoft didn't actually control OpenAI. That became painfully obvious in November November 2023. When OpenAI's board abruptly fired Sam Altman, Nadella reportedly learned about the decision only minutes before it went public. Despite investing billions, Microsoft wasn't really in charge. That moment changed almost everything. Microsoft immediately began investing in its own AI models while racing to integrate Copilot into every product it owned. Windows became one of the biggest targets. Suddenly, Windows wasn't just an operating system anymore, it was a distribution channel, a place to put Copilot in front of hundreds of millions of users overnight. From Microsoft's perspective, it made sense. If you're trying to compete with ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, and every other assistant out there, having Windows gives you an incredible advantage. There's only one problem. That's not why people use Windows. Most people don't wake up hoping that their AI turned into an AI assistant. Not yet. They want Windows to launch quickly, search quickly, update safely, and just run the applications, and then disappear into the background as they use the software they need. Microsoft wasn't trying to build the best operating system anymore. It was trying to build an operating system and an AI company at the same time. And that change didn't just affect the software, it changed who actually controls your PC. And that's where things become much more controversial. Hey, by the way, we haven't addressed it yet, but we just hit 600 subscribers. And saying I'm grateful is an understatement. This channel has been a really big part of my life and just something really cool to always look forward to. And y'all have been just so supportive and genuinely rooting for this to work out. You guys are literally the best. So thank you. Back to the story. For years, Microsoft insisted that Windows 11 wasn't just another version of Windows. It was a fundamentally more secure operating system. And to support that vision, Microsoft introduced one requirement that would become surprisingly controversial: a tiny chip called the Trusted Platform Module, or TPM. On paper, Microsoft's reasoning made sense. A TPM is a dedicated security chip that stores encryption keys and other sensitive information, making it much harder for malware and physical attackers to compromise your computer. For business, that's genuinely useful. But millions of ordinary users saw something very different. When Windows 11 launched, perfectly functional computers, machines with modern processors, plenty of memory and years of life left in them, were suddenly declared incompatible. Not because they were slow, not because they couldn't run Windows, but because they didn't have the right security hardware. Overnight, countless PCs became unsupported, and in case it's not already obvious, people are not happy about that decision. Microsoft argued that it was about security, but users saw something different: control. And the TPM requirement was only the beginning. Setting up a brand new Windows PC increasingly required an internet connection, then a Microsoft account. What used to feel like your computer slowly became another endpoint in Microsoft ecosystem. Files synced through OneDrive, passwords synced through Microsoft, your identity itself became tied to Microsoft servers. Again, none of these decisions are rational on their own. Cloud synchronization is generally useful, password recovery helps people, account syncing makes moving between devices easier, but notice the pattern and the clear intention behind all these decisions. Every convenience also increases independence. Every feature makes leaving Microsoft ecosystem just a little bit hard. But perhaps the clearest sign that something had changed wasn't about security or updates or TPM, it was the interface itself. It's actually one of the clearest pieces of evidence that Microsoft's priorities has changed. Okay, so if you've been using Windows recently, you've probably noticed something that is difficult to describe. The operating system feels heavier. Menus open slightly slower, search behaves inconsistently. Some windows look like they're from 2009, some look like they're from 2026. Nothing feels entirely connected anymore. And that's because, under the hood, a lot of Windows has been changing. Historically, core parts of Windows were written using native Windows code, fast, efficient software designed specifically for the operating system itself. Increasingly, Microsoft has rebuilt parts of Windows using something called WebView 2. Think of it as embedding a miniature web browser inside a Windows application. From Microsoft's perspective, is brilliant. Instead of building different interfaces for Windows and the web, they can build once and reuse it almost everywhere. Development become faster and features shipped more quickly, but users often experience the trade-off: higher memory usage, slightly slower interfaces, and more inconsistency. Search is perhaps the best example. Once a Windows-defining feature, it now blends local files with Bing results, news stories, and web content. Searching your own computer no longer feels like searching your own computer. Even the start menu has gradually transformed. What began as a simple launcher has evolved into recommendations, advertisements, widgets, and suggested Microsoft services. The weather panel is perhaps the perfect symbol of modern Windows. Open it and instead of seeing today's forecast, you're greeted by clickbait headlines and sponsored content. It's difficult to imagine anyone is asking for this, because nobody really wanted Windows to become another social feed. They wanted Windows, which raises an uncomfortable question. If these changes are making the product worse, are they at least making Microsoft more successful? Ironically, all of this may have made Windows worse while making Microsoft richer than ever. If Microsoft's goal was simply to build the best operating system, many of these decisions made very little sense. Why make the setup more complicated? Why clutter the start menu? Why keep asking people to sign into Microsoft account? Why risk frustrating millions of loyal users? But maybe that was never the goal, because while many of Windows users felt like the OS was getting worse, Microsoft itself was doing better than ever. Since Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014, Microsoft's value has grown from roughly $300 billion into one of the most valuable companies on earth. Today, it's worth more than $3 trillion. Financially, it's difficult to argue with the results. Azure became one of the world's biggest cloud businesses. Microsoft 365 became a subscription powerhouse. Windows, holy voice crack. Windows, meanwhile, slowly changed roles. It became the gateway, a way to introduce users to Microsoft accounts, to OneDrive, to Microsoft 365, to Copilot, to the rest of Microsoft's ecosystem. Viewed through that lens, many of Windows' most frustrating decisions maybe becomes understandable. Not necessarily good, but maybe understandable. The OneDrive pop-up is there because OneDrive subscriptions generate recurring revenue. Copilot isn't inside Paint because artists demanded it. It's there because Microsoft needs people using Copilot. The Microsoft account is required because ecosystems makes incredibly valuable business. Every decision that frustrates users also strengthens Microsoft's platform. Windows slowly stopped being the product. You became the product being distributed to Microsoft's other products. And perhaps that's the defining characteristic of modern technology. The software itself is no longer the business, the ecosystem is. Okay, I don't think Microsoft forgot how to build great software. Windows 7 proved they could. Windows XP proved they could. Even Windows 10, despite its flaws, proved that they still understood what people wanted from an operating system. The engineers didn't become suddenly worse. The incentives changed. Microsoft became one of the most successful companies in history. But somewhere along the way, the priorities of Windows users and the priorities of Microsoft shareholders began drifting in two different directions. The disease is that Windows gradually stopped existing for its own sake. It became infrastructure, a platform designed to move users towards the next Microsoft's product. Microsoft seems to understand this now. Recent updates suggest they're listening, removing unnecessary AI features, improving search, giving users back customization they removed years ago. These are good changes, and I genuinely hope they continue because despite everything I've said, I'm not rooting against Windows. But listen, Microsoft, making Windows great again does not include another AI feature, okay? It's remembering why people loved Windows in the first place. Not because it constantly asked for their attention, but because it never needed to. The best operating systems disappeared, and maybe that's what Windows needs to learn again.